him to do a lecture at the AA over a couple of years ago, at the time when he just finished making the ash and silk wall construction down by the Thames Barrier. Unfortunately, he was just heading off for a DAD fellowship in Berlin and couldn't make it, so I'm glad he could make it 2 years later. In some ways, it's quite good that this has been postponed slightly, and he's giving a lecture this evening because we are soon to host an exhibition and conference entitled London Post-Colonial City, and in many ways, I think the work that Vong has been making and the issues he's been grappling with do relate to the exhibition, and I think it's a good time, really. For another reason, it's good to have him along to the AA. He's worked with architects and landscape designers for a number of years. The Thames Barrier piece, he worked with Dewhurst Macfarlane. At the moment, he's working with Nicholas Grimshaw Partners and a number of other practices. What characterizes his work very often is not so much a discrete architectural, sculptural object in a kind of classic gallery sense, but more working with a number of agencies, designers, clients, in a very collaborative way, which makes his work very distinct, I think. Anyway, I would like to welcome Vong to the AA, and I'd like you to join me in doing so.
Thank you for the introduction. First of all, I would like to say that I normally don't give any lecture, so tonight it would be let's consider tonight as a talk rather than a lecture. And the other thing is I don't like talking about the work, especially when the work is next to the room, but likely tonight there's no work to look at or to be seen. The slides that I brought with me tonight encompass a period of practice of over 5 years. I didn't put them in a chronological way because some work took 4 or 5 years before they become realized. Therefore, ideas and the chronology don't always fit. But what I will show you first is a selection of selection of works. We won't go into details of this work, but just to give you an idea of how the work started, mainly in this country. Before that, I was in France. I came to this country in '85. So the work that I have selected to show you tonight, most of them started in the late '80s up to now. Is it possible to switch off that light? Yeah. Is it out of focus or? Thank you. This was a detail of an installation work that I did at the Arnold Finney Gallery in Bristol. It consisted of a wall of rubber blocks, made up of rubber blocks. The idea of the wall was always permanent in my work. that probably goes back because of it was my status as a refugee at that time. As I said, I live in France, but originally I come from Laos. I spent about 11 years in Laos, and I was sent to France to study and spent another 14 years there. And this year is my 13 years or 14 years in England. The notion of the world was constantly permanent, as I said, simply because it's something that on the quotidianity, everyday's life, I was constantly facing to this dilemma, being French or being Laotian or being British. And at the same time, I still don't feel that I belong to a specific, what you may call, status or citizenship. And therefore, most of the work that I was producing at the time was to face the questions, but at the same time try to avoid being identified or try to self-impose an identity. The only identity I may have was to put myself in the middle of crossing, almost. And behind the wall, you have a space which became redundant. And inside of that space, we had three Laotian words suspended in the air, made out of clear red neon. Again, the notion of the wall, the frustration, was added to that notion by not giving any translation of this word. Therefore, the semantic, the semantic meaning becomes redundant. Therefore, as a viewer, you can only rely your interpretation. How do you say? Not from a written text, but from your own experience, and being strange to this language, and being also frustrated simply because you don't have access to it. Other type of work were produced around the same period of time, taking a more sort of direct sort of impact with the viewer, simply because I was using family snapshots, images. This is a piece called Fragments, and it's made out of, it's a slide projection, 2 carousel slides protecting reworked family snapshots and reworked Laotian writing. The slides, images dissolve into each other. And what interested me at that time, it wasn't the first or the second images from one or the other projector, but mainly the third, which is the juxtaposed picture, which is there just for a very brief moment. And from that third image, I was hoping to create a third meaning of the whole work, rather than fixing these images, but dealing with a more sort of transient temporary images. There was about, I can't remember, maybe 30 electric ventilators fans, all up and running, forming a circle on the wall, and all running at a very slow speed, therefore creating a gentle sort of stream within the projecting space. The focus was on the propellers. Therefore, what you have here, which looks like a very solid image, but in fact it was a very fragile, flickering effect. Again, around that period, the same period, I was doing other type of installation work. This one's called Tokten Kepkin Bodai, which means in English, what falls to the ground but can't be eaten. Sort of riddle, Laotian riddle.
Can you say the title once again?
Sorry?
Can you say the title once again?
It's what falls to the ground but can't be eaten. It consisted of an arch lead and a forest of suspended bamboos. Again, the same sort of notion of wall and gate was used here, and inside the bamboos you have another sort of space. And the use of the light and the shadow was very important in this work, as the light was the answer to the riddle, which is the title. The piece itself, I mean, the installation was about 12 to 14 meters long, and it was first shown at the at Chisenham Gallery in north of London. This is another sort of version of Tokten Din Kepkin Bodai, which is this time the bamboos not only were suspended but also touched the floor, simply because the gallery ceiling wasn't high enough, but at the same time it didn't make any difference. Other experiment I was doing was with light was to use neon light and other material. In this instance, it was rice. I first had the idea of using rice and neons in sort of around 1987, and the neon rice field was only realized in 1993. That's why I said right at the beginning that chronology doesn't seem to work with the work here. Sometimes you have to wait until you, for financial reason, for practical reason, you have to just put a project aside until the right moment happens. Another a similar version of this work was first shown at the Venice Biennale. It was just white fluorescent tubes covered by rice. With this work, this work actually was shown alongside with the rubber bricks on a 10 meters wall, long wall, white wall, and it's about 2.5 meters high. The entire wall was covered by this tiny wire Laotian words. What I like with this, it was another way of producing the work. You only need a simple tool, which is a pair of pliers and a roll of wire, and with that you could be traveling, watching television, running around, sitting in the tube, and and the words come to you, and you start bending the wire and cutting them, and then you materialize that word. It becomes concrete in a wire shape. And then the next stage was to drill holes, and each letter was inserted into the white wall. It's without saying, it took a long time to install. But again, it was an opportunity to bring out that obsession and the by increasing the scale of the work with these tiny ideas. What I just showed you was just briefs of fragments of work, and some of them they all took different direction from that time. One of them, which is a neon sort of type of work, took another direction, and this is one of them. This work was commissioned by IMA, the Irish Museum of Modern Art. I don't know if you've been to that museum, but it's an old military sort of building with a central courtyard. There used to be a twin building in Paris, but that one was destroyed about 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And it was used as a military hospital. What I did was I have chosen a dozen words, Laotian words that are connected to equatorial disease, because part of it is to do with the colonials and the empire at that time, I wanted to sort of bring all these elements together within that room, the past, the history of the building, the connection or the involvement of the European countries in sort of some part of Southeast Asian countries, and oops, sorry. Just go very quickly. What we have here, what I asked the first thing I asked the museum was whether it's possible to interfere with the building as it is a listed building, because somehow I felt that the work has to penetrate the actual building rather than just sit on it or being suspended, or or somehow has a superficial sort of touch. And what I asked them to do was to be able to drill holes into the joist and lift off all the floorboards and be able to see the ground underneath the actual building itself. By doing that, I also asked them to the work itself forbids people to enter by the main access, so you have to go through the long corridor, which you can't see, but it's on sort of right corner of the picture. What we have here is probably, I can't remember the exact number of the lines. There's maybe 6 or 12, I can't remember, of red light, fluorescent red light. And the line turns themselves into these words and then redisappear, because etc., etc. And then similar version was made for other exhibition, and this one was at the Apple Foundation in Amsterdam. Another version has been made for this South African Biennale. Instead of having 6 lines of on the floor, mainly on the floor, but this, what we had with 6 lines on the floor and then went up to the ceiling, on the wall and to the ceiling. Is it possible to do the focus, please? This was another project I did at Killerton Park. It was a National Trust, and it was a group exhibition just outside of Exeter. One of the curators knew that I was working with the notion of barrier and wall. And that time approached me because she had this long wall, the kitchen, the garden kitchen wall, Victorian red bricks. And she approached me and said, we have this wall. Usually when in a group show, within this sort of context, the curator would ask you, just find your old side and present us a proposal. But for this instance, for this case, she just came straight to me and said, could you do something to the wall? Probably hoping that I would do something the other side, because there was a car park. And suddenly I realized there was a luxurious, sort of luxuriant landscape, almost read in our day as a British landscape, sort of typical British landscape garden. But going back to maybe even 100 years ago, all these palm trees, the bamboo, and the mucus or whatever, were probably the most sort of exotic plants they had in that park. And so the idea was to somehow reuse the same idea by bringing these Laotian words and and hang them to the wall to create the same kind of exotic notion, almost the same way as what you may see in our day in any cities. Chinese takeaway or Indian restaurant become part of London street sort of everyday life. This is mainly to propose or to make it in an obvious way. There's different layers of how you can look at things, how you can approach what you see in the place that you live, etc., etc. So with this work, there are different layers of interpretation or different layers of reading. You have the foreground, and then the foreground with the wall and the Laotian writing, and then behind that, what you may call another sort of a landscape, which almost very typical of sort of Devon. With the hill and pine trees, etc., etc. Some of the work took different direction by dropping all the references to the Laotian script, by opting for something more abstract, by being closer to the material chosen. In this case, it's the work. It's the beginning of the installation of the neon rice field. For this work, it was mainly the light, the quality of light, and the other material is the rice. Again, by juxtaposing two materials, or one the rice and the other one is the neon, the red light neon, we create this something that I never been able to obtain when I was practicing paintings before I turned to sculpture and installation work, which is this quality of light, and also the other dimension that I couldn't get with painting was the three-dimensional aspect of the work, plus the challenge of pushing the material that's been used beyond what they are seen as rice or as neon. Which is, again, going back to the third meaning that I was talking about earlier, which is somehow to allow the work to exist as it is, rather than just as a pile of rice and neon light. Sometimes with installation work, there are unexpected things, just as here the sunlight coming in, and you just have to live with it. And sometimes it's a bonus, and sometimes it could be difficult to deal with it. But most of the time, I would study the space first and making sure that I could bring out everything that is already in that room or on the side, rather than fighting against or trying to lose it. other attempt with the neons was to mix it with other material. In this case, is the wax. The neons were simply they were dipped into a hot bath of wax. After maybe half a day, you will get this kind of result, like a stalactite or stalagmite, whatever, which way you're looking at it. This is a beginning of an installation that I did for Sculpture Hut Hill, which is down in south of London, between London and Chichester, in the sculpture park. The work itself was first commissioned by the Reina Sofia, part of a group exhibition curated by Dan Cameron. And the same work was brought back to England and redesigned to fit the new space. But the main concept remained the same, which is a trench in a sort of V shape, sunk into the ground. And filled with Lycian strip made out of clear blue neons. The whole piece, the piece is called Azure Blue Neon. Azure Blue Body Neon. Most of the words refer to human body. Some deals with the surface of the body, and some deals with the internal organs. And they were all melt or sort of piled on top of each other. This was in a Reina Sofia building. When you approach the room, the first thing you see is just a blue light. It's only when you enter the room, when you from a ramp, then you little by little, progressively, you see the work itself. But even before that, if you are accompanied by another person, the first thing you'll realize is the change of the color, skin texture of your neighbors, and that's the first impact of the work. And the next stage is seeing the work and hearing all the buzz of the transformers, and also the flickering effect of some of them. This was the collaboration, or this it was a commission by PADT for public art project in Greenwich in 1993. It was an open competition. It just happened 3 or 4 years after the Berlin Wall came down. And I had the opportunity to show some work in Frankfurt in 1991 or 92, I can't remember. And at that time I did propose to build a wall as a work, which didn't go very well. So when I saw the PADT advertising about reclaiming a derelict part of Greenwich outside of the Thames barrier, as part of a larger project of revitalizing the entire area. I thought it was probably the right time and the right space to present this idea again. And also what happened the day I went to the interview, simply because I never been to that area of London. I just walked for, I don't know, miles and miles to this building where the interview happened. And when I arrived there, the people from PIDT asked me, how did I come? I just say I walk. And they were completely surprised, simply not knowing the area. I just crossed an entire area of London where there was a lot of crisis in terms of racial and crimes, etc., etc. And of course, I did notice that the corner shop was heavily sort of protected, and sort of you almost order your pint of milk through a metallic sort of window and things like that. But I didn't know that how grave was the situation in that area. And the wall was the whole idea of the work was to bring out, somehow it's to create a monument of contradiction. The wall itself acts as a wall, but at the same time doesn't function as a wall. You can walk around it, you can't walk through it. And it's almost there without any sort of any use in terms of if you consider it as a wall, not like the Thames barrier that has a engineer purpose. It's and then the two main material, or three main materials: glass, silk, and ash. The silk sort of had this resonance of sort of the connection of the England or British culture with sort of the eastern part of the world. The ash, almost there was the ash that we use came from various origins, from friends, sort of fireplace, power station, rest of burnings, all kind of mixture of ash. And the glass, I wanted the glass I wanted something that reflect at the same time the environment. As this picture can show you, you get all this reflection of the buildings around it. So the work itself has this sort of imposing presence, but at the same time reflect sort of its surrounding. So it has this, every time it has this sort of somehow it wants to be there, but at the same time it didn't want to be there. You have that kind of ambiguity. Working, it was one of almost the first project that I had to work with other profession. In this case, we work with Stuart McFarlane, specialized in glass, because I wanted the structure to be entirely in glass, glass structure without using any steel or whatever frame to support the whole thing. And therefore it was important to have expertise from glass engineers. It was almost from that time that I took the decision of sort of to collaborate with other people from now on. This is something that I did when I was in Berlin. It's called Atopia, which means no place. After spending a year in Berlin, as a guest of a DAD, most of the artists would be asked whether they would like to do a project before they leave or during their stay in Berlin. And that question was asked almost 2 or 3 sort of months after I arrived in Berlin. And my first reaction was that I may be doing Berlin work in a year or 2 years' time, as it takes always time to digest everything that happened to you in a new space, new environment, new language, new culture. But just before I left Berlin, I did a similar piece, which consists of one shelving unit. And I thought, if I had to do something in Berlin within that year, I wasn't prepared to sort of produce an entirely new work, but maybe it's to start from an existing work and then develop that work. And it turned out to be this work. It consists of 2 long sort of shelving units, creating placed parallel to each other, creating therefore a central corridor. What you see here is the first view when you enter the gallery space. Therefore, if you want to see the rest of the work, you have to break your sort of back by bending yourself under the lower shelf, and you find yourself therefore in the central corridor. And I felt that it was something that has to be something similar to this, similar to the experience that I came across when I first arrived in Berlin. I felt that I had to break my back in order to get used to the new stuff, to the new life in Berlin. If you don't break your back, if you don't make that effort, then you won't be able to see a little bit more of what is there. The material used here is the rubber, 100% man-made. It's a material that I came across when I was doing the rubber brick wall. Therefore, sort of, I don't know how many years before that. But when I came across this material, I just couldn't do anything with it. um, but it never left me because it has all this potentiality simply because it has no shape. They come in a big bundle of 20 kilograms, and the material itself is very flexible. It just runs and runs. It doesn't have a shape. So you put it in a cube, whatever, it will fill that cube and sink and take that shape. Or if you hang it on the ceiling, it will drop, creating a long, thin sort of line. And I didn't want it to turn it into something ludic, or I mean play. The whole idea behind this work was to accentuate the notion of witnessing something. And this work, because of the material that was chosen, is changing constantly, every minute almost. From the moment you enter the room and the moment you left, if you turn your back and look at it, it won't be the same work almost. Even if you have spent only 10 or 15 minutes in that room. As I said, it's witnessing. The same way I witnessed life in Berlin. The same way I was frustrated by just being there only for 1 year. It was a very interesting residence because they give you a salary, they give you a flat, they give you a studio, they give you access to all kind of equipment, and in return they don't ask you anything. And a lot of people, a lot of former guests couldn't cope with that idea. Some sort of after a year started to say, you destroyed my life because now I'm going to be poor again. And some just, wandering around day and night, just having a lovely time, just sort of. And then you have, problem with couples because one is the guest and the other one sort of the shadow of the guest. All kind of, But what was great is they don't only invite artists, but they invite composers, musicians, writers, filmmakers, and you have all this sort of melting pot of all these people, and that it's possible to create sort of to come together and to if you feel it's the right time to work with other people. Atopia, I forgot to say, that consists of 2 works. One was the rubber piece, and the other one is an outdoor piece. One happened in the what you may call the former East Berlin, and the other one is in the former West of Berlin. So the rubber piece happened in an old villa in the former West Berlin. Old villa that used to belong to a famous Jewish silent movie actress. And this is on the roof terrace of the actual, when I was there, was the DAD office. It used to be a scientist office for the scientists, East scientists working for the government. What happened to focus, or is it my eye? Is it really bad? No. Anyway, it should be sharper than this, and you should be able to see pigeon sticks on the sides. It's okay, I just changed. These are, you probably all came across this invention, which is to keep the pigeons landing on roofs or whatever sculpture or public sculpture or stuff under tunnels, rail track tunnel, whatever. Is to deter pigeons. And it's just started by this image of one morning sitting in the kitchen and looking up out of the window, and I saw a man doing this gesture. It looked, first of all, very poetic and sort of positive act, giving something. I thought he was feeding the birds. And little by little I realized he was sticking these sticks on the edge of the window, so just to stop them landing and to extend his territory. And I just had the idea of using that image and extend it on a dimension that almost what the Western sort of German government is doing, what with the former East, Berlin, sort of the wall came down, but you have a different type of invasion on sort of horizontal way. And this is the sort of metaphorical answer that I that I came with the work. The same idea then was repeated in England when I was approached by the curator of the Royal Festival Hall, the ballroom. She came to see me because she saw some beautiful sort of neons work that I did, and wanted to show them. Like most of the curators, when they approach you, because they saw something and they love to present that type of work again. But then by the time they got in touch with you, you're already working on something else. And it's very difficult to sort of convince them that what you are doing is more important than what you've done 4 or 5 years ago. So it's a constant sort of a dilemma every time a curator approached you. So when she came to see me, she has the idea of the neon rice field and the neon's blue, azure blue body, etc., etc. And certainly I presented her the rubber piece and the pigeon sticks. First of all, it took about half an hour discussion to sort of to make her, to understand sort of that there is continuation in the work, except that the work visually took different sort of form. For this for this project, I propose sort of a kind of pool with 3 steps made out of this material called I can't remember the name now. Polycarbonate, something like that. And the pigeon sticks are made of stainless steel, so it's slightly different to the one that I use in Berlin. And the whole idea was to create a no space within this ballroom where normally people come and use it for dancing or whatever. So the work become sort of takes place in this public space, but at the same time denied that space at the same time. So it's going back to the self-contradiction. I think in terms of visual, that's all I have to say to show you tonight. And as Andrew said, that other type of work that I'm not able to show you at the moment simply because I am still working on them. It's mainly a collaboration with architects. One of the projects that I'm doing is with Nicholas Grimshaw's architects team for the new Bath Spa in Bath. I was asked to the duty for that job was to be a lead artist. The lead artist in that project is to come up with a water feature that will link the new spa to different areas of Bath surrounding the new Bath Spa. And also the other things that I have to do is to consult to act as a consultant for various space, potential space for artwork within the new building. The building itself is going to happen, but at this stage, which is a rare opportunity for an artist, is to work with architects during during the designing scheme. Usually, the collaboration you have with architect is sort of almost to you are asked to fill a space that hasn't been sort of approached before or left behind, or one could say felled by the architects. But this is quite rare. While we all work together during the design scheme, everything could happen. Any suggestions are welcome. And simple question is art should be there within that building is always present usually, because if you get the proportion right in a building, usually you don't need a three-dimensional sculpture or bronze or whatever. So the different input that I've been able to to give in this project was mainly to sort of to make sure that the architects understand that art doesn't have to be a three-dimensional sculpture or a waterfall feature or lighting system. So it works on a different level. The other work that I'm doing also is working with a collaboration with a landscape architect called Lynn Kinnear for the Royal Hall, the Holloway College, Royal Holloway College, re-landscaping the space just outside of the new international building. Again, the similar problems are found here. Like every time the university needed a new building, they just build it, and when they needed a physics building, they just built one, and they need a language building, they build another. But you have all this grey area that hasn't been resolved, which is almost the space between the buildings. And also all these buildings, because they were built at different period of time, you have all this clash, and the grey area become almost sort of somehow is another wall between one department and another one. Their territory, sort of, they don't want to go over each another. So with the landscape architect, this is what one part of the work was to tackle all these questions. That's why I don't have any pictures or sketches even to show you tonight. Another sort of recent relationship that I have is to work in constant with an architect architecture firm called Uchida Finlit. On this is a permanent discussion and communication and conversation I've been having with them for almost 6-7 months now, and my role is mainly to be involved with right at the beginning of any schemes or any competition design or whatever, and therefore by doing that we are trying to reduce the gap between the preconception that we have, the gap between the architecture and art, and it's almost a beginning of a relationship. It's a partnership. It's a collaboration. It's we don't know where it goes, but it's worth trying. And I can't see no future working just in the studio, producing studio-based type of work. It's worth extending that horizon. It's one way also of extending the message and testing the idea of the third meanings. That's all I have to say tonight. Thank you.
5 or 10 minutes for some questions?
Yeah.
We have about 5 or 10 minutes, I reckon, for some questions, if anyone has some questions.
You said that you don't see any future in just working in the studio practice.
Yes.
Why do you say that?
Because I think, for me, life is too short just to, barricade myself within the four corners. It's one way of testing new ideas as well. Because what I don't like in that way of working, I mean, it doesn't mean that I'm going to stop working that way. It has other advantages. But usually you're testing your ideas, and then you bring it out, and you have that kind of relationship with the rest of the world, take it or leave it. But I think for some other type of ideas, may use different system, may you have to use different infrastructure, and that infrastructure is about collaborating, working with other experts.
Not very fair, but it's just that normally artists don't get paid as fairly when it comes to collaborations with architects. Are you in a state of complaint about that? Or I'm knowing from other people, that they
Well,
don't
these
really
two
argue
projects that I mentioned, the Bath Spa and the Royal Holloway College, is a scheme that is run by Royal Society of Arts. And it's, let's say in terms of payment, it's very close to tutorial fees. So it depends on the number of the days, I mean, it's a job. You take it as it is,
Yes, it's not.
So
It's not done quite in the same way.
you're not earning the same way as you would be selling your work through an art gallery or
No,
whatever.
but you're also not being
It's a
paid
person.
as a percentage in the same way that the architect is demanding fees. And what I'm saying is artists still don't
Well, what
have
happened
this
is
set up.
you are paid during that work contract, and then what happened is if you come up with an artistic project, then it usually they would go for Arts Council national lottery application, and then if that is accepted, then you will be paid for producing that work. So it's up to you to to put forward the fees. But I don't know if whether it's going to reach that point. That's another thing. We have to play national lottery.
One thing that occurred to me was it seemed that that the references to the language and to the text of where you were born is obviously quite prevalent in the work in the late 80s, and it almost seems that over more recent years, maybe perhaps in working with collaborations with other people or working on larger scale, some of the more personal engagements in the way you described working with the bits of wire on the tube or walking or whatever else, that kind of almost handmade involvement, and also the intimacy of using your own kind of born language or whatever seems to have kind of moved away slightly. Is that something that's cyclical and will maybe come back, or do you feel yourself?
No. As I said, it's the works took different directions. I mean, only the problematics, took me down different roads. It doesn't mean that I've stopped that way. As I said earlier, studio-based type of work is still that still exists in my sort of timetable. But rather than spending, let's say, 80%, I'm spending only 50, for example, and maybe 30% with all this collaboration and 10% teaching, and
I suppose behind the question of wondering whether the longer you spend, I know you were in Berlin for a year, but the longer you spend in London, perhaps the more you have a sense of home or something like that, or is that the case?
It's it becomes home, but at the same time it's tricky. You become blind, because you are used to what you see, and you just take it as a sort of it's notion of quotidianity. You don't. And one thing that I've learned through all this experience was to, every time you look at things, you're trying to look at it from slightly different angle. Just move, slightly. It's the only way, avoiding to become blind to what's in front of you. That it's about looking and seeing. As I said in some of the work, it's looking. It's all to do with the cultural luggage. The seeing it's almost goes beyond that level. And as an artist, I try to see rather than just to look.
Following on from that, you'd only say, because you mentioned that the social context of some of the sites has been influential. But, I mean, for me, the pieces often work very strongly in a formal sense. That they, would you say that is a strong influence of how you take on the site? I mean, you were leading up to that.
Yes, I mean it's it's very difficult just to avoid, even if when you deal with what you may call a neutral site, let's say an art gallery space, you are still working within that structure, that framework. But when you leave that framework and you, like the Thames Barrier or the roof terrace of the DAAT or air raid shelter that I didn't show actually. It's very difficult to deny that space. But instead of just hiding it, I would prefer to get to know better that side and use what is already there, as I said. So whether you call it inspiration or interaction or whatever, it's more a question of tuning.
And I think, for me, you're talking about denying and sort of exposing at the same time. I think, for me, many of your pieces are very successful like that. Something that I would say, at first sight, the piece in Goodwood. I mean, you come across it in such a shock to see this blue neon writing. But the whole point is that although it's a juxtaposition side with all the green leaves and trees, you consider the avenue, if you like, as a long stretch, forces the trees apart. I think that's very powerful, and yet it could have been that you weren't that interested in how you. Some artists will almost get other people to lay them down. It's the idea. I mean that there is a, like we get this fine tuning.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Maybe it's time at 8:15 to retire to the bar on Friday evening. I'd like to thank once again Vong Phaophanit.
Thank you.